Hi, everybody. Welcome to Scoop 2, our second iteration of Scoop, which is an invite inside our newsroom here at Smarter News. And we could talk to you a little bit more in depth about some of the big headlines of the week and also give you a behind the scenes perspective about some of the editorial decisions that are being made around all sorts of newsrooms all over the world that impact how we're telling the stories that we're telling. And we have a lot of ground to cover today. And in fact, I want to give a quick shout out, a quick thank you to the Policy Circle. The Policy Circle is a great organization, a nonpartisan group that is in place to promote civic discourse, which is something that we hope the media is a part of as well. The good, healthy, nonpartisan news is also about. And the Policy Circle has a great event that's taking place this week that you can attend for free. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that a little bit later on in the program, but just want to thank them for their partnership as well. So speaking of newsrooms, here's how this is all going. As I've mentioned to you, we're at the very beginning of this insider community we're building, this group of people that's come together to support a free press. I'm so grateful for you for all that you're doing for us and building this dream and really building the solution in news. And so we're still sort of working out the process of how are we doing this? How are we actually producing the scoop at the beginning of the week? We want that really good foundation for you. So if you can listen to something in one swoop, that rhymes unintentionally, scoop and swoop, but it's going to work here. In one swoop, you can actually get a good dose of what's happening for the week and sort of free yourself up from chasing all the headlines. So, in preparation for this program, one of the things I do regularly in general with Smarter News is I do sort of what I call a brain dump. This is when I kind of just take everything that we've been thinking about for the week and all the different facets of stories and put them down on one piece of paper. Building a program and delivering news is a little bit like a collage. You want to put all the pieces down and then you sort of see how do they work together, because they will always have a connection that's unexpected. And if we're really trying to produce something different with Smarter News, not only dedication to nonpartisanship and showing both sides, but also giving you a little bit more in depth than just a list of headlines like many broadcasts, we have to do this. So I poured out a bunch of topics on a piece of paper on Friday. And one of the humbling things about news is that you can kind of have an idea of where you're headed, and then suddenly breaking news happens and everything changes. Then you have to throw out all your work, which happens very regularly and actually happened this week, because I thought really what I'm going to do for Scoop, our second Scoop, we're really going to focus on the economy. And then once you note it, a lot of international events happened. And now we're going to kind of just switch our entire broadcast. But that's what you have to do in news. One of the things we did know was coming up this week was Columbus Day, Monday. The day that we're broadcasting right now is Columbus Day. But I also wanted to mention Indigenous Peoples Day, because President Biden was the first American president who actually commemorated Indigenous Peoples Day on a federal level. And we'll get to whether or not it's a federal holiday or not. But this is what happened. This is what happens inside an editorial room when we're trying to plan for a broadcast. So on Friday afternoon, I get a call from my friend who's helping me with Scoop. And she has a great, amazing background in journalism. We've worked together in the past. We really like each other professionally and personally, which doesn't always happen. And maybe I'm going a little too far, but I hope she agrees with me here. And she calls me and she says, "Hey, I saw your note. I think it's really great. I just want to mention, I'm half Native American. So if you need any extra insight on Indigenous Peoples Day, let me know." And I was actually pumping gas at the time, true story. And I was thinking to myself, I really need to get a video of this. The gas prices are going back up. This is also part of the news. I said, "That's funny. I'm actually half Italian, half Genovese, and Christopher Columbus is Italian from Genoa." And we had this kind of exchange, this fun exchange where we said, "Wait, you, me, us?" That's look at we're representing both sides of this day. And we had the kind of a brainstorm of, well, how should we cover this? What should this look like? And that's what happens in newsrooms a lot, is that you have people with different backgrounds that offer a different perspective. One of the questions I get as a journalist often is, well, how are you able to cover so many different topics? Especially if you're from a particular culture or background or gender, how are you able to cover something that's totally outside what you've experienced? And it's a great question in journalism. It's also something you could apply to other fields, though. Does an expert heart surgeon have to also undergo heart surgery to understand how to do it correctly? Might give them a new perspective, might make them different with their patients. But does that actually have to happen? So there's no way for us all to experience all different backgrounds and all different perspectives in our own body. But as journalists, what we're supposed to do is seek a lot of different perspectives. There's two things that can really make you good as a journalist: discipline, staying true to the facts, and seeking more storylines. The more perspectives, the better. It's like a dance party. More people on the dance floor, the better. More storylines, the better. It's better for your audience. So just thought I would share that. We are brainstorming different ways that we could actually pull in different storylines about Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day. Just want to touch on this really quickly. It is interesting to note, in order for something to become a federal holiday, it actually has to be approved through Congress. So right now, the federal holiday is Columbus Day. Depending on your state, your state may celebrate Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day, or both or neither. But the federal holiday is still Columbus Day. There is legislation that is in Congress somewhere at this point that hasn't moved far enough to actually get to a vote where Indigenous Peoples Day could be an official federal holiday. But there is legislation out there for that. So here we are with kind of different perspectives on this one day. One of the first states to ever acknowledge like a Native American Day, which is actually what they call it in South Dakota, is the state of South Dakota. And it's believed to be the first state to do so. And there's several states that do so based on their own heritage. And that day came up in the early 1990s. So just a little background on that. Thought that was interesting to flag for you. And one other thing, I did ask my friend, I said, well, what would you like to add? What do you think would be good to add to this conversation, considering, there are different perspectives on one day and people are commemorating different things. And she said that she actually had some really good Native American news platforms that she likes to reference. And so I'm going to make sure to put those in the links as well to our special report, because you could check them out. You know how I feel about primary sources. You got to go directly to the sources. So that's going to be fun to take a look at. And I really appreciate that. So we're going to move on. Speaking of history, there are a lot of historical events that have taken place in the month of October that strangely intersect with our news cycle right now. And you can't anticipate this or predict this. It just happens. In the late 1930s, Albert Einstein wrote President Roosevelt at the time, warning about nuclear weapons. That letter got to President Roosevelt's desk in October. The Cuban Missile Crisis that you may hear about, and is often actually referenced in the news even today with President Kennedy, happened in the month of October. And here we find ourselves in the month of October talking as well about nuclear weapons, nuclear power, and broad conflict. Why is that all happening in October? We don't know, but sort of an interesting intersection of history and our current news cycle. One of the reasons we're talking about this isn't just what's happening around the world, Russia and North Korea, we're going to talk about, but also some comments made by President Biden. And this, I searched all day for this. I was very curious about whether or not these comments were on record, meaning, were they recorded? Was the audio recorded? Was it on video? What do we need to know about these comments? Turns out no one has these comments on audio or on video, at least so far from what I've seen. These comments were made behind closed doors at a fundraiser in New York City. Sometimes these fundraisers, by the way, are there's a lot of security involved, because if they're a small enough group, you're getting face-to-face interaction with the president of the United States. And this is to raise money for political parties and to make sure you're supporting certain efforts. So apparently this is what the president said. And I say this with a degree of confidence because the international news wires have all picked it up. There's nobody that's saying this didn't happen, including the White House. But this is what the president had to say that caused a lot of sudden consternation. He said, "We have not faced the prospect of Armageddon since Kennedy and the Cuban Missile Crisis." And he went on to talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin and said Vladimir Putin was, quote, "not joking" when he talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons. So that's the president of the United States. So this starts a flurry of activity. And this is happening where we're also seeing tensions rise in Ukraine. And so you have the confluence of these different news items. One of the White House's most prominent spokespeople for the National Security Council actually had to answer a couple questions about President Biden's comments just this weekend. In the last 24 hours, news is quickly changing. But I think it's important for you to hear how the White House is responding to questions about the use of the term Armageddon and questions about, well, wait a minute, how close are we really to a conflict?
The White House has said these are consistent with comments he has used in the past, but he's never said anything quite as stark as this. So is the president right? Are we facing a potential nuclear Armageddon?
The president was reflecting the very high stakes that are in play right now, Martha, when you have modern nuclear power and the leader of that modern nuclear power willing to use irresponsible rhetoric the way that Mr. Putin has several times in just the last week or two, as well as the high tensions in Ukraine over just the course of the last few days. So the president, I think, was accurately reflecting the fact that the stakes are very high right now.
And he gets a daily intelligence briefing, military updates from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So are the statements the result of what he has heard or his own conclusions? Because those were really frightening comments.
His comments were not based on new or fresh intelligence or new indications that Mr. Putin has made a decision to use nuclear weapons. And quite frankly, we don't have any indication that he has made that kind of decision, Martha, nor have we seen anything that would give us pause to reconsider our own strategic nuclear posture in our efforts to defend our own national security interests or those of our allies and partners. What the president was reflecting was that the stakes are high right now, given what's going on the battlefield in Ukraine and given the very irresponsible and reckless comments made by Vladimir Putin in just the last few days. Now, look, he's also said we're not going to be intimidated. Neither we nor our allies are going to be intimidated by this. And we're going to continue to provide support and security assistance to Ukraine as is necessary.
That is John Kirby. John Kirby, you might recognize his voice because he used to be the spokesperson for the Department of Defense, for the Pentagon. He served in a bunch of different positions around government. Actually enjoy listening to him because he tends to actually try to answer the question, which is not true of all spokespeople. Sometimes they try to evade the question or deflect. But you can hear what he's saying. In summary, he's saying, listen, the stakes are high. We don't see anything of imminent threat right now, but we're in a precarious situation, which going back to the question by Martha Raddatz of ABC, hey, this is scary. What's the reality here? And that's what she's really trying to get to the bottom of. So I thought that exchange was important. I wanted to show you this. When we're talking about nuclear weapons, who has them? How many are there out there? I think it's important to note that Russia, according to what we know and what's available as far as public information, Russia has the most nuclear warheads of any country. The United States is behind that. There's been a series of different treaties, as you likely know, about trying to control arms for different countries and who's going to have what. But this gives you an idea of who has nuclear weapons. You have Russia, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Israel, Pakistan, India, China, and North Korea. So that's what we know at this time. And remember, it doesn't take a lot of nuclear weapons to cause a lot of destruction. You just need one. And so that's why there's continuing concern about what's happening in Ukraine and this ratcheting up of tension. Speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about what happened in Russia over the weekend, because you likely have seen some video of this and it'll give you an idea of just the power of this explosion that happened on this bridge in Crimea. This is a very strategic, important bridge that links Crimea, which is a peninsula, to Russia. It's an important supply route. And this is also really an important bridge to Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin was actually there a couple days after Russia took over Crimea and said, this is actually our land, not Ukraine. This happened a couple years ago. He was actually there walking the bridge. I'm going to show you some photos of that in a second, to talk about this grand opening of a pathway between Russia and its territory. And it was a real stance by Vladimir Putin. So this is this is not just an infrastructure attack. This is also very personal. This happened as well just a day or two after President Putin's birthday. Let me just show you some pictures of him on the bridge. This is from, I believe, 2018 or so. He's on the bridge. He was with construction workers. They drive across the bridge. Funny fact, in looking up this story, by the way, apparently the construction workers adopted a cat. And this cat decided that it was actually going to be the very first animal to cross the bridge. And we have photographic evidence of that cat that led the way for Vladimir Putin. No word on where the cat is now, but just sort of a funny side story. The more important picture is this, that Vladimir Putin knows how important this bridge is. This was a big attack to infrastructure for Russia and a big blow. And now the question is, well, what is the response next? We have seen a series of attacks. We're waking up to a bunch of attacks on Monday where you can see Russia unleash a flurry of different attacks all over Ukraine in places that we haven't seen in recent weeks or even months. We know that Russia has had a series of defeats in Ukraine. And although you can see this bright swath of red that shows how much territory Russia is claiming, there's been this trend of Russia being pushed back. And so the question then is, well, what comes next? And that's where there's a question about, well, what is the power that Russia turns to? What is the further retaliation, if any, that takes place now in Ukraine? Because if you're seeing these explosions, if you're seeing this ramp up of infrastructure attacks like bridges, well, where does this go from here? That's something apparently President Biden was talking about in this private fundraising event, which is, what is the off ramp? Where does Russia go to from this point on? And also, how does everyone get off of this conflict? So important to note that we're going to continue to watch what's happening in Russia. I can't help but think about our interview that we had with David Satter. David Satter joined us a couple months ago. He was one of the final American journalists that was operating inside of Russia. He was kicked out a few years ago, but he lived in Russia throughout the Soviet Union. He saw the rise of Vladimir Putin, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and modern day Russia. And one of the things he's talked about is Vladimir Putin's ability to take something and to justify something else. It's his thinking, David Satter's belief, that Vladimir Putin planned terrorist attacks inside his own country to justify the use of force inside his own country. So the question I have, you have Ukraine not necessarily taking responsibility for this, by the way. They're kind of trolling Russia. They're you have different government officials talking about this bridge being bombed, but no one's taking responsibility. We have no one taking responsibility for the Nord Stream pipeline damage, by the way. Still no word on repair. I just checked this morning. Still no word. Russia's basically saying we're not getting the permits to even check, so we're not doing anything. And so I can't help but wonder, the most obvious explanation is Ukraine bombed this bridge. And we don't know what happened with the pipeline. But if Vladimir Putin is used to justifying further violence based on past violence, you just have to wonder, where does this go to? Where is this going to next? And it's a scary thought. Speaking of that, we can't turn away from it, though. It's a scary thought, but we have to continue to deal with the facts as they are on the ground. And these are the facts as of today. We know that there is a turning up the dial of tension in Eastern Europe. In the meantime, though, we're also watching what's happening in North Korea, because North Korea, we know, is a state sponsor of terrorism designated by the U.S. government. We know that North Korea has a series of nuclear weapons, and we know they've done a series of missile tests. The North Korean government released these pictures. North Korea is celebrating a day, like a national day of celebration for when this particular party came into power more than 70 years ago. You can see the North Korean leader standing here gazing at these missile tests. We don't know exactly how this shot was set up, or, how it was edited or any of that. But this is the sort of image that North Korea wants to give to the world, that they will not back down from their enemies. And in the talk of their enemies, they're talking about South Korea, they're talking about the United States. And on that, I just want to show you this one graphic, because we tend to think about what's happening in North Korea real far away from a country that we don't know a lot about. And you can see from this graphic, there's a range of what North Korea's missiles can reach. And the United States is within that range. These missiles can carry nuclear warheads. And so this is why there is a question about, where does this go from here? We're asking that question a lot. We have a lot of missile tests. You have ratcheting up attention in North Korea. You have more rhetoric that's more violent and aggressive. What happens next? What is the end game? And that's a question we're going to be asking for Russia, North Korea, and we're also going to be asking for Iran. There's always a question about the relationship between Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Worth mentioning here that Iranian drones have apparently been used in Ukraine. So there's an exchange somehow of weapons. One of the first trips that Vladimir Putin took outside of his country over the last year has been to Iran. There's been a variety of different reporting to suggest that Iran, North Korea, and Syria have had a relationship in the past. We know that American intelligence believes that Iran has been or has in the past tried to pursue building nuclear weapons. There are those that still believe that's taking place today, but we know that Iran also has their handful with protests that are happening on the ground. And those protests are continuing at this time. And the one thing I really want you, this is a very little mentioned news item that happened over the weekend, but I think is really important. The Institute for the Study of War that builds maps like this, like that you're seeing when it comes to Ukraine, they put out all sorts of really interesting research on conflicts all over the world. One of their notes today said this, that there's a concern, a heightened concern about Iran attacking U.S. assets or facilities. In fact, there was an attack on a U.S. base over the weekend, didn't injure anybody. The United States is not blaming anyone for this. But the Institute for the Study of War, which is a powerful think tank in Washington, D.C., widely respected, says that the belief is Iranian-backed militia. Remember, Iran is a state sponsor of terror, so perhaps a terrorist group has attacked this asset in Syria. And again, the question is, what's next? Iran blames the United States for these protests that are happening inside Iran. The Iranian government calls them riots. So these are all these different, they're almost like little tension points all over the world. Russia, Iran, North Korea. What's the end game for any of these countries? In the meantime, you have the world emerging from a pandemic, a question about an economic slowdown that could really affect each and every one of us. And this curiosity about what's the next chapter and what changes the trajectory. What stops North Korea from shooting off missiles? What happens in Iran? Do the people actually get to change who's in power? What's Russia's next move in Ukraine? There's a big what ifs, and a lot of these different headlines could suddenly change the entire news cycle, which is why this week, instead of starting with the economy, I wanted to start with this. The economy is important, and we're going to turn to what's happening at home here now. We have a big week, a lot of big news. I kind of want to say hyper local news, very specific to America, and I'll explain in just a moment. But the economy, when we're talking about economic data, we're talking about either data that's backwards looking, so something that's already happened. We got the jobs report on Friday. It was taking a look back at the previous month, not what's happening right now. Or you have economic forecasting that's saying, oh, well, based on a series of variables, this is what we think the economy is going to look like. Both of those things are not necessarily helpful for the here and now because they're not present. You're not getting an actual read on what's happening in the economy. And we know when it comes to forecasting, you get one big international event and everything changes. And it's important to remember that as we get real tight with the data and trying to say, are we in a recession? Are we not in a recession? What's going on with the job market? What's going on with retail? We have to remember that a lot of the data that we have is backwards looking and a lot of the future is uncertain. So that's important to remember. What's happening this week, a very interesting intersection of the news again. On Thursday, we're going to get inflation data. It's going to talk to us about whether or not our US dollar continues to buy us less than it once did, which is why we got to watch. High inflation means your dollar is actually buying you less. That never feels good. It feels like prices are going up and that people are having a harder time keeping up with their bills, which is never good. The U.S. consumer is really important for 2/3 of the American economy, any sort of economic growth. But guess what? We're important for the rest of the world as well because the U.S. is the largest economy. So your decision about whether or not you buy that pack of gum, sometimes it sort of feels like, oh, well, this is just like a bunch of wealthy people making decisions. No. Are you buying that soda? Are you buying that coffee? Like these little decisions actually add up and matter to how the economy is working. So we're going to get inflation data. It's going to look back on the previous week. So any of the recent rise in gas prices or oil prices aren't necessarily in there, but it'll still tell us something about inflation. On that same day, we have the next meeting of the January 6th committee. And this really brings up a question about, as a news organization, well, how do you prioritize this for your audience? Both things are important. The January 6th hearing and that special committee that's investigating January 6th, let's talk about why that matters, because this has been spread out. This sort of hearing has been spread out in a way that I've never seen in my journalism career. Usually hearings take place over a course of a couple of weeks. They're very compact. They're very focused. This has spread out over months and months and months. It's happened in the evening. It's happened during the day. It's happened using different video and source. It's just been a totally different way of presenting an investigation by Congress. And that's what this is. What we're watching is, one, going to be a matter of public record about what happened that day, who was involved, and why that matters. But it also, the findings of this congressional committee can actually be referred to the Justice Department and used as part of an actual legal investigation. This is not a legal investigation. This is a congressional investigation. Those are different things, but that doesn't mean they can't overlap. So we're going to be watching to see what else does the committee want to share. One of the reasons why this is spread out over such a long period of time is the committee says there's so much research to go through. There's so many documents. There's so many people to interview. And as there are public hearings, more people are coming forward and are willing to participate. So they're saying, listen, we're just trying to keep up. On the other hand, you have those that say this is all just a politically motivated hearing to hurt Republicans before the midterm elections, hurt former President Trump, who may be running for president again, and that this is all politics. So you have two very different perspectives on this hearing. As a journalist, I'm curious. I'm always wondering, what are we going to learn that can be news value for you? And just to kind of take you behind the scenes here, this has been a very difficult thing to cover, because of the length of time of the hearings, the amount of people following the different storylines and the audio recordings, the video recordings, and trying to figure out, well, how do we do it in a balanced way where we're covering it, but we're staying disciplined? Because it's very easy to sort of be kind of taken away. You see other networks are going to scrap their entire programming for the afternoon on Thursday, and they're just going to take this whole thing live. And they're just going to air the whole thing. You know, we have different capabilities here at Smarter News, and I want to make sure, okay, if you don't have 3 hours to watch a hearing, what can I grab for you? So what we decided to do way back when, and I'd have to think about this again if we see something similar, you know, another hearing that's spread out over months and months, we've just decided to take 90 seconds of the best sound of the hearing. That's what we decided to do, because I feel like if there's 3 minutes a day that maybe I get you, then 90 seconds of that could be the hearing on that day. And we kind of bullet point what's important. And of course, we always have to balance out, you know, are Republicans commenting on what they heard, even if they're not participating in this hearing? There's 2 Republicans that are participating, as you know, but there was unlike other hearings where you have half Republican lawmakers and half Democrats, this has mostly Democrats. That goes back to the beginning, by the way. Republicans, it depends on who you ask about what sort of story you're going to get here. But apparently Republicans put forward names of people they wanted on the committee, and the Democrats said, no, we're not going to accept those names, which is very unusual, because usually they do accept the names. But apparently these people could have been involved in January 6th or part of the investigation, so they didn't want them on the committee. And there's different thoughts about that. So then Republicans said, well, fine, we're not going to give you any more names, right? Kevin McCarthy says, I'm not sending any more people. I sent you people. And so then there's no participation by the Republicans, except for example, one of the co-chairs, Liz Cheney. So this is a it's not only important historically, but it's also a hyper political environment here. We are 30 days ahead of the midterm elections. So what I don't know, which is also very atypical of these sort of hearings, is I don't know how many more hearings we'll get before the midterm elections. I don't know if this will be our last one. I don't know who we might see. We don't really know who's going to appear. There's been a question about whether or not Vice President Pence will participate. There's been a question all along about whether or not former President Trump will be invited to participate. So there's a lot of unknown going into Thursday, but we'll continue to watch to see what sort of news unfolds. And I'm really curious on your side. And on social media, it's very difficult to cover this. There's no winning in it. You could put up a clip and someone thinks that you didn't go far enough or you went too far. And there's all this fighting in the commentary. One of the things I love about Scoop so far is that there's not that. You actually seem genuinely interested in asking questions about not only the coverage, but about the events. And I'm curious what you would like about the January 6th committee. At the end of it, would you like a big summary review of what we learned? Are you not interested in it at all? There are parts of it that you feel like the news is missing. There is definitely a focus on, instead of actually focusing on the content, there actually has to be a lot of focus on strategically covering it, which takes you away from the content. So it's been a challenge. It has definitely been a challenge, and one that I'm curious how it sets a precedent for future hearings, whether or not this is the new way that Congress will do hearings, with an outside producer, lots of video, the lawmakers tossing, like I am, to sound bites, the video clips. So there's no way of telling, and I'll be curious to learn more along with you on Thursday. There's no way of anticipating what we're going to see. So real quick here, I want to tell you about a great event that is, speaking of civil discourse and being a positive factor in your own community. The Policy Circle is a nonpartisan group that really tries to promote this amongst women. So getting women together to meet and talk about some of the major issues in their own community, and also learn a little bit about, how to get more involved. So once a year, they hold a leadership summit. And I was lucky enough to actually be invited last year. I was able to do just a kind of a breakout session on storytelling, which was a ton of fun. I've never been to their leadership summit before, and I have to tell you, it was such an incredible experience. So many interesting people from all sorts of backgrounds, a ton of different speakers on a variety of different topics. This was actually focused on water resources and environmental resources, but this year it's a totally different topic that I think we could all relate to, which is thriving communities. How do you build thriving communities? Which is what we all want, right? We want a thriving community. So during their leadership summit, you're able to register for free, and then you could attend any of their live events. And this year the live events are about all sorts of different conversations on education, on healthcare, on crime, for example. And you can go through and pick what you'd like to listen to. You can listen to it live. You can listen to it later. And what I loved about this is, when you kind of listen to podcasts, it's always with an expert, someone that's risen to a high enough level where they're able to kind of speak from a position of authority, but maybe aren't in the trenches every day doing the work. And one of the things I loved about the Policy Circle Summit last year is it was the people that were actually doing the work that were on the panels, that were saying, this worked for me, this didn't work for me, this is what I think is left out of the national conversation, this is what everybody needs to know. And accessible, interesting thought leaders that are busy working and solving problems in their own community. And that's why they're not podcast stars. Although some of them are. You'll see the lineup. There's quite a few very interesting, different profile of people that have worked in all sorts of different areas, some of which who do a lot of speaking, some of which are working in education every day. But the Policy Circle found them and said, hey, this is really important. We need to hear your voice. Let's elevate your voice for this leadership summit. So I'm going to put a link to that as well in this special report, so you're able to join. Check it out. It's worth it if you're kind of looking for something, just to listen to, want a little bit of a break from the news, break from your regular podcast, just want to learn something different this week. Surf around. You're going to find something great. And I was so impressed by their summit last year. I'm excited for you to get an opportunity to check it out this year as well. So that information will be out there. In the meantime, I'm really curious about your questions, comments about the news. I know we covered a lot of ground today. I'm looking through all my different graphics. We really covered all over the world. And it is easy. You don't want to let the news overwhelm you to a place where you feel paralyzed, that you feel so nervous about what could happen next that you can't operate. I'm always of the opinion that we need to mention what the world as it is, what we're learning as we're going, so that we can use the historical perspective, getting to past Octobers, and learn from the past and understand, well, what do we do then that helped us avoid major conflict? For example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, what did we not do in the late 1930s that led to further conflict and eventually the use of nuclear weapons? And we're at a place where we have a lot of material to work from. And so one of the things I want to do this week is reach out to a couple historians. I feel like that could be great added value for us during this time. People want to mention the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, like everybody knows everything that happened on it. Listen, everybody needs a refresher. It involved the Soviet Union. So here we are. We have we involved Russia. So we have the same sort of players, but very different circumstances of today. So what can we learn from the past? And that's a question I'm going to be asking. So I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you again for all your support for Scoop and making this a reality. And that's the scoop for this Monday. I look forward to seeing you next week, and we'll have more on all of these items on smartnews.com. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.